Crassus exercised a kind of soft power, as opposed to, a bit crudely, Caesar and Pompey and the others who were classic Roman generals who got their power and authority by going abroad and killing lots of people and bringing lots of stuff back. So Crassus was a different kind of politician. And of course, that particular kind of tycoon politician has had a much more lasting and enduring influence on the future of politics than the generals who just went in and grabbed what they could.
Hello and welcome to the Aspects of History podcast. My name is Oliver Webb-Carter and I'm the editor and your host. This week's podcast is a chat with Peter Stothard, journalist, newspaper editor, Knight of the Realm, but most importantly, classicist. Peter was on the podcast back on the Ides of March when we talked about the assassination of Julius Caesar, among other things. Today we're going a little bit further back in time to talk about Marcus Licinius Crassus, the subject of Peter's new book, Crassus, the First Tycoon. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with Crassus, you've surely seen Spartacus, the 1960 film directed by Stanley Kubrick, with Kirk Douglas in the title role, as the leader of a slave revolt against Rome that began in 73 BC before Crassus defeated Spartacus in 71. By then, Crassus, along with Pompey, were the two most powerful men in Rome. Laurence Olivier played Crassus brilliantly in the film, so it's absolutely fine to keep his image in your mind as we talk. Crassus, as you'll have heard at the start, was not a brilliant commander, but he was a brilliant politician and fabulously wealthy. Peter will tell us about this tycoon, and indeed the origins of the word tycoon, which I didn't know until today. Crassus came up against Parthia at the end of his life, and this empire, which had emerged from the Persian, Macedonian and Seleucid empires, was based around, roughly, modern-day Iran. All these events were during the early years of Julius Caesar's political and military career, but it wasn't long before the vacuum left by Crassus's departure was filled by Caesar. If you can, please do subscribe. Coming up on Tuesday, I've got our bonus Black History Month episode, but in the meantime, I'll hand you over to Peter and myself chatting Crassus, the First Tycoon. Peter Stothard, welcome back to the Aspects of History podcast. And we're here to talk about your new book, Crassus, the First Tycoon. And this is a part of a series, I think, actually set up by the publisher. Is that right?
Yes, Yale had this idea, came to me during the lockdown. I was working on another book, a bigger book, and it was becoming a bit difficult because all the libraries were closing. And the guy, James Rom, a good guy, a bard in the US, reviewed The Last Assassin, which you and I talked about, very favorably in the Wall Street Journal. And then a few days after that, he called me and said that Yale were doing this series of short ancient lives, and would I like to do one? And we talked about it for a bit, and Crassus came up, which suited me fine because it was a book. It was a narrative, short, pacey, I hope, good read, which I could write in those now long forgotten lockdown days without having to be spending too much time in the university library.
It is pacey. I raced through it. I mean, it's only 150 pages as well.
Well, that's the idea of the series, I think, is to write these short. I mean, they're only just starting. This is the first one. But that's the idea, and I think it'll be a great success.
Yeah, I had a look at some of the other titles. I noticed James Rom himself, who's quite he's a great scholar of the sort of Hellenistic age, isn't he?
He is, and he's doing Demetrius, the sacker of cities, as we always used to call him at school. Curious enough, being a sacker of cities, which sounded sort of quite romantic moment at one point. When you see what's going on in Ukraine, doesn't seem quite so such a jolly concept as once it did. Maybe.
No, you're right. Actually, I'm just remembering when I loved Demetrius and thought his nickname was wonderful. And you're absolutely right. You can't really. We live in different times now, I think.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, he was a very romantic figure, Demetrius. Anyway, James will probably talk to you about Demetrius at some time.
We're here to talk about Crassus.
But it's quite interesting, as you say, how classics, names, events do shift in relation to modern experience, and Crassus is certainly one of those whose people's attitude to him has changed hugely over the years.
Yes. So did that mean that you came in with a kind of preconceived idea of Crassus, and then it's shifted slightly, or is it shifted over because you've been writing about Roman history for many years?
I don't think I had a preconceived idea, but I had done a book on Spartacus. I'd followed one of my early books. I'd followed the journey of the Spartacus through Italy. I wrote a book called On the Spartacus Road. That was before you and I met. And it was very conscious of the fact that Crassus was really famous in modern times as the eventual victor, suppressor, and crucifier of the Spartacus slave rebellion. And it is very striking, of course, that for Crassus himself and for his Roman contemporaries and for almost everybody at the time, that was something they'd rather not think about. And if they did think about it, they didn't think it was very important. And it was certainly not something that Crassus was ever going to do Crassus any good, because however successfully you swatted a slave rebellion, the Romans would thought, well, that was obvious. Obviously you're going to do that, so you don't expect to get a triumph or any praise for it as well. And Crassus knew that, so he didn't expect any glory from defeating Spartacus, and indeed it disappeared from Roman literature, and everybody just tried to pretend it hadn't happened. It was only in the late 19th century, at a time of first of all sort of Italian independence, and the left in particular, were looking for the very rare number of sort of possibly communist Marxist role models in the ancient world, and there really aren't very many. So if you were studying Roman history, if President Putin, for instance, had attended any Roman history lessons at school, Crassus would have been one of the someone he would absolutely have known about, because he was the capitalist, nasty villain who was doing harm to the Marxist hero Spartacus. And so that's really where Spartacus came back, and that's where Crassus came back. So he came back as a really, really bad guy. Whereas, that's sort of Laurence Olivier did the rest in the movie, and yes, very bad guy.
Well, I'm glad you've mentioned that, because that I'm sure our listeners, the moment they hear Spartacus, immediately think Kirk Douglas and, of course, Laurence Olivier as Crassus, and he's quite kind of Laurence Olivier himself, he just sort of plays this rather sort of smooth, he's slightly slimy, very obviously fabulously wealthy, but public school, Oxbridge educated type Roman general. How close do you think Olivier got it right, do you think?
Well, I'm sure Olivier wasn't attempting to get it right as we would see it at all. He was representing a particular kind of anti-slave, anti-nasty Roman oppressor, as seen in Howard Fast's book and in Kubrick's movie. And of course, he did it absolutely brilliantly. Crassus was certainly a hard man. I think we can say that. He had although he came from the upper classes in Rome, it was a long time in Roman history before you could get very far without having at least some decent start. And Crassus had a very good start, but he wasn't supremely rich, his family, and he was known throughout his whole life as a rather modest liver. So not like Laurence Olivier in that way. He was famed for only having, he built houses and owned 2/3 of Rome, but he only lived in one house, and he rather despised the people, I think, who bought his houses in order to show off. and he wasn't famed for wine, women, and song or anything like that. He married his brother's widow. Now, he'd been killed in the civil wars, and although of course people said, well, because Crassus's only fame was for greed, the only reason he married his brother's widow was in order not to have to send the dowry back, because in those days the bride came with money, and if she stopped being a bride, the money had to go back to the father. And people said, oh well, he doesn't really fancy his wife or want his wife, but he certainly wasn't going to send the money back. That may have been unkind. He seemed to have had a very good, he seemed to have stayed with her a long time, and they had two sons, one of whom plays a very big part in the story, and another who is the only is the most visible surviving Crassus left. We can talk about him if you like.
Yeah. Well, I was rather the first paragraph in Plutarch's Life of Crassus describes Crassus as being sort of almost the family, the Crassus family were quite close knit, and they like to spend time together. And that immediately sets off, oh, well, I could sort of relate to him, and immediately then think that he's treated terribly badly by all his competitors during the 1st century BC.
Well, he was a very unusual politician and a very unusual leader, and that's why he's interesting. That's why he's worth writing a book about. And I've called it the first tycoon, because a tycoon is a particular kind of rich man, a particular kind of politician. The word was invented or entered into American English to explain to Americans how Japan worked, because the Americans turned up in Japan to try and open up the markets in 1860, the famous story, Commander Perry and the gunboats and all that. And Commander Perry wanted to go and see who was in charge, and he had a letter for the emperor, and they had to tactfully to say him that the emperor wasn't actually in charge of anything really, except relations to God, and so no point in talking to the emperor, and he should talk to the shogun, but the shogun just meant general, and Commander Perry, who considered himself the emissary of the American president, wasn't going to be fobbed off with some general. So they persuaded him that he was a tycoon, and tycoon meant someone who's a lot more powerful than he seems to be. And that was the trick of Crassus. Crassus was quite visible in Rome. I mean, he had jobs and he had real roles, and he did a lot of speaking in the law courts. But most of his power was lending money, sort of bribing, cajoling, organizing, buying and selling. And he sort of bought and sold power, and therefore was exercised a kind of soft power, as opposed to, put it crudely, Caesar and Pompey and the others who were classic Roman generals who got their power and authority by going abroad and killing lots of people and bringing lots of stuff back. So Crassus was a different kind of politician, and of course that particular kind of tycoon politician has had a much more lasting and enduring influence on the future of politics than the generals who just went in and grabbed what they could.
And I suppose the Romans, because he wasn't a traditional militaristic ruler like Pompey and Caesar, they don't really respect him in the same way.
Well, that was why he made his eventually disastrous attack into the Middle East. It is an absolute truth about any character in Roman history that if you end up as a failure and everybody else is basically distancing themselves from you, then you tend to get a pretty bad press. And that's true for Roman emperors. It's true of, if your successors basically didn't like you and were trying to distance themselves, then the biographers and the historians tended to reflect that. And Crassus has had a very bad press for that because he ended up as a failure. But if you take his life in the round, I mean, he began with a small but very, very important military success in allowing Sulla, Rome's first dictator, to take power. He won a battle when Pompey was somewhere else. He and Pompey were rivals for Sulla's favor. But when the big battle came along, Pompey was in the wrong place, and Sulla was, and Crassus was in the right place. And so Crassus won this battle of the Colline Gate in 82. And Sulla was very grateful. And it was on the back of that and the sort of breakdown in Roman society and the opportunities there were to buy up a really wrecked and shattered, burnt and ruined Rome, that was the foundation of Crassus's particular kind of power. It was built on a battle, but it was consolidated by a completely revolutionary way of seizing and achieving and holding power, of buying stuff that was available because of the war, and then trading on it and doing all the things, not unlike the Russian oligarchs at the end of the Soviet Union, or the friends of Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell, who did so well after the dissolution of the monasteries. They were guys who saw there was an opportunity, took a risk, and there were risks in doing it. It didn't just fall on to them on a plate, but he took the risks and set up a completely different kind of politics, which worked extremely well until he wanted to do the other kind, and then it didn't.
And in the meantime, Pompey, his great rival, is he's desperate to. All the Romans are desperate to be the new Alexander the Great, aren't they?
yes. They weren't very imaginative in their heroes. Yes, Caesar was very sad that he hadn't achieved all the things that Alexander the Great had achieved at his age, and yes. Pompey got allegedly the cloak of Alexander, which was like one of those medieval Christian relics, of which I'm sure there were very, very many red cloaks of Alexander. But anyway, Pompey thought he had the one. Yes, being Alexander was definitely something that the Roman generals wanted to do. But of course, being a military genius is a skill given to few, and both Pompey and Caesar in their way particularly Caesar, were military geniuses. But I think Crassus probably knew that he was, although perfectly competent and able to do stuff, he wasn't in that league until quite late on his career, far too late. He thought that in order to keep his position up as being a possible first man of Rome, which is what they wanted to be, if not an Alexander the Great, at least he could be the top dog in Rome. He would have to do some military activity of his own. And it was when he stepped out of his comfort zone that all the trouble started.
Yes, and we haven't mentioned the Parthians, who are kind of a thorn in Rome's side for many, many years. The Parthian Empire emerges out of the sort of remnants of the Seleucid Empire, which is coming out of the Alexander the Great's empire and the Persian Empire originally.
Yes, the Romans didn't know much about the Parthians, and to be honest, neither do we. In fact, one of the most important sort of morals of the whole story is that the Parthians hadn't really been much trouble to Rome. They were a tribe that came down from the Caspian Sea. They were Scythians, in as much as we can tell. They occupied huge areas of, as you say, the vacuum that had been left by the fall of the Seleucid kingdoms after the death of Alexander. And they set themselves up in a very different kind of way to Rome. And whether they were really any threat to Rome is extremely doubtful. But nonetheless, the Romans had this idea. Some Romans had this idea that there was no end to Roman conquest, and so they were looking. Once they were looking for things to conquer, and that was the position when Crassus decided he would take them on. No, I don't think they were really any much of a threat at all. Not surprisingly, having once Crassus had taken a big army over there and had suffered his catastrophic defeat. Later on, they did become somewhat more of a threat, and they weren't as easily controlled by Rome as other people. But no, to call them it was a bit like saying the Ukraine was a threat to Russia. I mean, you could say it was for political purposes if you wanted to attack them, but actually was highly doubtful.
Well, I'm certainly not an apologist for Putin's Russia, but surely by their mere existence as a kind of autonomous empire on the borders of Rome made them a threat in Roman eyes?
Later on, to some Romans, the period that we're talking about in the first century BC, really not. There'd been almost no connection to Parthia, and that's one of the most interesting things, really, about what Crassus's move from being a banker, a power broker, a puller of strings, a creator of Caesar, almost was a creator of Caesar in order to balance Pompey, all the things that Crassus was really good at in Rome. His desire that he wanted to conquer Parthia was based on extremely low level of knowledge about what was going on, because these Parthians, there were very few Parthians in Rome, maybe none. There was very little writing about Parthia, really hardly any, when it was then reliable, but very, 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 very doubtful. So they didn't really know what they were going in for. What they knew about the Parthians is what they sort of had picked up from other places, was basically that Parthia would be ruled by old guys who were sort of cynical old kings, who, if you went in with a few Roman legions and threatened them a bit, they would do a deal. They would pay you off. They would pay you to go home. You could come to some kind of arrangement with them, and everything will be absolutely fine. And I'm sure that's what Crassus thought would happen. Again, a little bit, if you really want. I'm not that keen on these parallels, but if Putin had been facing, instead of Zelensky, one of those many old ex-communist warlords, who had sort of bureaucrats, really, more than warlords, who ran a lot of those states after the fall of the Soviet Union, he would have expected, to be able to more or less call the shots and do a deal and, exercise his will. But he didn't realize when he invaded Ukraine that Ukraine under Zelensky was a different sort of place. And to be frank, neither did many people in the West either. So he was a bit of a shock. And when Crassus invaded Parthia, he didn't get very far into it. And instead of some old king arriving, to do a deal, he found this young, extremely charismatic leader called Serenus, who, fighting a kind of war that Crassus had never heard of and knew nothing about and didn't understand. These slaves on ponies, effectively, with bows and arrows, with the arrows constantly being reloaded from the backs of camels, and was able to destroy Roman legions in a way that was really not supposed to happen. And so Crassus failed. For someone, it was particularly ironic for Crassus because he was a meticulous planner. He wasn't a fly of the pants kind of guy. He when he was building things, he trained slaves. And to do everything. He trained slaves to be builders. He trained slaves to be scribes. He trained slaves to be lawyers. He trained slaves to do everything. And when he set up his army to conquer Spartacus, again he conquered Spartacus in the same meticulous way. But when it came to fighting in Parthia, although I'm sure he thought he was being very meticulous,
because he arrived a year earlier, didn't he, to the final battle? So he didn't just sort of charge in, did he?
No, and indeed he fought one or two skirmishes, did very, very well. There were stories that emerged from some of these fights of these particularly powerful arrows, like these particularly powerful artillery shells, if you like, that seemed to be able to pierce Roman armor as other arrows couldn't. But he didn't sort of, if anybody said that, as most famously Gaius Cassius, the guy who eventually joined the conspiracy against Julius Caesar. Cassius was Crassus's number two on this expedition, and he was perhaps a bit more realistic, or at least claimed to be. And he said, "Look, you've got to take notice. There seem to have some weapons here that seem to be able to do things, and do we really have any cavalry to counter their cavalry?" And Crassus said, no, you're just being defeatist. You're showing, you're sowing defeatism among the troops by talking about all these things that you say are going to bring us down, and I don't believe them. I mean, I'm preparing it and planning it my way, overruled Cassius, and therefore was in no position therefore to deal with this astonishing new imaginative kind of warfare which he hadn't been expecting.
Now he also had his son there, and it's rather a sad. Well, it's a sad ending for father and son, just like it was for Crassus's own father and his brother in the civil wars.
Yes,
many years before.
Yes, absolutely. He Crassus's last sight of his own father, who was a sort of moderate conservative, if you like, trying to sort of broker between two pretty extremist factions, and like a lot of moderates when wars and troubles get that way, he got sort of squeezed out. And so the last sight he saw of his own father was with his head on a pike, or head on the rostra, in the forum, on a spike. And the last sight he had of his son was his head of his son being brought back on a spear, after, in an attempt to deal with this extraordinary tactic that the Parthians were using, he'd sent out his son and his cavalry to try and deal with it as a cavalry battle, and the son and the cavalry did no better than his infantry had done. So Publius Crassus, the son, who was a great hero, war hero for Caesar. I mean, he was the hope of the family. He saw his head was brought back on a pike too, and that was at that point Crassus had to start planning his escape, which went well for some of his officers and for some of his people, but didn't go very well for Crassus himself.
Just going back in time a little bit, back to the Spartacus revolt, which I know we've touched on, but I'd be keen to just delve into that a little bit more, because it's quite a big to the layman watching movies and knowing a bit about Roman history. The Spartacus revolt, because of the film, is a huge event, but the Romans, as you've mentioned earlier, I mean, the way they viewed slaves, they would have been mortified that a film would have been made commemorating the revolt. But how was the revolt viewed by the Romans, and then how was the revolt itself? What was the reality?
We know quite a bit about this, and because we know that. To start with, the Romans didn't take it very seriously, because they sent out, and the film is quite accurate at that point, they sent out essentially a sort of Dad's Army group from Rome. One of the rules in Rome was that you weren't allowed to have soldiers in Rome. Soldiers had to stay out of Rome. So they did have a sort of, well, Dad's Army is perhaps a bit unkind, but they had, some older retired soldiers who they could put together into a band, and they were sent on a kind of jolly. Don't worry, chaps. You whop a few slaves, and we'll have a good party afterwards. And they came a tremendous cropper, because Spartacus's band of escaped gladiators and people who joined him turned out to be more than a match for that. So, and then once that had happened, still nobody serious really wanted to take it on. But Pompey, who was the big man at the time, even though Crassus didn't like to admit it, Pompey sent a couple of his supporters, so senior to the Dad's Army guys, but not Pompey himself, and they went off, and they took a slightly better army, and they too were completely smashed. After that, it was the powers that be in Rome, the Senate, had to sort of take the idea of Spartacus a bit more seriously. But it was a complicated thing for them, because if you're a slave-owning society, all slave-owning societies are very frightened, some part of them themselves, about a slave escape and a slave revolt. They always have been, and they always were, and that's key. But they didn't really want to talk about or accept in public the fact this was a possibility, because it suggested that the enslaved people were kind of equal to them, which is not something they wished to. So it's complicated and quite a subtle problem. So when they realized that Spartacus, might even have been able to march on Rome, it was certainly doing a huge amount of damage to their land and their farms and their houses, including a lot of Crassus's own. And the treasury, for various reasons, was rather empty at the time. So Crassus was ideal because he was able to hire his own army, organize it just as he'd organized all the slaves on the building site. He could pay them. He became famous for his line that no one should dare call themselves a rich man unless they could finance an army from out of their annual income. And so he did all that, and then he set off to deal with Spartacus, which he did with mainly by extraordinary earthworks and building huge ramparts across the toe of Italy. And the pirates so that was part of his day job, really. He used his building work did for them in Spartacus in one way, and his banking did for them, because the pirates who Spartacus was relying on to let them escape to Sicily, where there are a lot of potential slaves who would revolt, were sort of bought off by Crassus. We're pretty certain, and so Crassus used his basically day job skills of buying, bribing, selling, and building in order to defeat Spartacus, and then had, of course, the problem of what to do with the survivors, and he chose this particularly unpleasant way of dealing with those, which made sure that he had with a everlasting bad reputation in the not just in Russian schoolboys, but pretty much everywhere.
He was sort of debating whether to use the slaves in his mines in Spain, wasn't he, to get some kind of financial reward out of it all? But then decided that he would have been attacked politically for that.
Yes, it's difficult to get into his mind. One of the problems about writing about Crassus is that Plutarch, as you mentioned earlier, who's a very important source, and had various different ways of writing, and he wrote these books of people, all of whom lived at the same time. And obviously, he was most interested in Julius Caesar. So Julius Caesar is a long and detailed account compared to Alexander the Great. He was quite interested in Pompey too, because Pompey was so he did. But Crassus, who was the third prong, or the third leg of this stool, they called it the three-headed monster that was running Rome by the time he left for Parthia. He was constantly looking for new things. He had to find new things to say, and the easiest thing for him to say was to say that he was a very greedy man, really nasty, greedy man, and turned the life of Crassus into something very different from the lives of Pompey and Caesar. You were talking about, you were reading them. The life of Crassus is more like a sort of morality play, and every line in it is really designed to say, greed gets you in the end, and greed is sort of un-Roman and unmanly and not a kind of model for anybody. So no one wanted to be a Crassus. So the Crassus story in Plutarch is filled with stories that were different from the ones that they were talking about Pompey and Caesar, because he was a writer and he didn't want to keep repeating himself, but also were a kind of morality story attacking Crassus's greed.
And the way Plutarch, because he paired Roman lives with Greek lives, and that's quite illuminating in itself, seeing who he matched Crassus with, because Julius Caesar's matched with Alexander.
Yeah, Crassus is matched with another rich guy who was a failure in war, Nicias, who, I don't know if we've ever done an item on the Peloponnesian War, but
we've touched on it very briefly, but I don't think we did mention Nicias. He's
Nicias was the conservative mine owner, richest man in Athens, who was a rather conservative influence on the conduct of the war, and he was set aside a much more flamboyant, Caesar-like figure, if you like, called Alcibiades, who roused people up and said, "Look, we're going to go and conquer Sicily, and we're going to really hammer it to those Spartans." So Crassus was paired with another rich guy who came a cropper, who was who was overtaken by events, you might say, and lost control of events, and that was Plutarch's way of balancing those two. But it's a good read, Plutarch's Crassus, and he does have these odd, interesting little details. It's quite sort of on Crassus's exile. When Crassus leaves after he's seen his father with head on the spike, he has to basically leave town a couple of years later because his life is at threat. And he retreats to Spain and lives in a cave. And so Plutarch's quite interested in this story because most of his big heroes don't spend any time in caves. But he makes the point that it was quite a luxurious cave, and that some of his friends used to send up what he described as, or the English translators described as, comely slave girls who were to climb up the hill to his cave and say that they were looking for a master. And this was the kind of Greek, kind of slightly erotic kind of detail that appealed to Plutarch, which he could use in relation to Crassus, which he wouldn't have done in relation to his bigger, more solid Roman examples.
Plutarch was Greek himself, wasn't he? Is it Carrhae?
Yes. He was the priest at Delphi, and an extraordinary writer. We would know a great deal less about a whole lot of things if we didn't have Plutarch. Not just the biographies, not just the parallel lives, but a huge amount of else about how the Greeks and how the Romans did, because Plutarch had this particular idea as a historian of encouraging Greeks to think that the Romans weren't better in everything. Because at that stage, by the time Plutarch was writing, Greece was a sort of university. Athens was basically a sort of gap year destination and a kind of university town at best, and it had long past its days of being really important. But Plutarch wanted to remind the Greeks that although they lost a lot of their military and political power, there were still heroes in their history that were as important and as morally up to the Romans, and probably superior to the Romans. And that was how he did his balanced lives, and that's how Crassus. That was one of the ways in which Crassus's reputation suffered. Failure, Plutarch, and then the fact that his biggest event was, apart from failing in the desert, was crushing a slave rebellion, meant that Crassus pretty much disappeared from anybody's. There's no Shakespeare play about Crassus. No one wanted to touch him. But when you pull the whole story of his life together, as I've done in these, as you say, not a long book, but it does point out that actually his contribution to the way we run our politics was probably more lasting. Well, if not more, well, it was more lasting, but certainly more continuous than a lot of the more glamorous activities of the people of Caesar and Pompey.
I mean, although his life did end in failure, and we haven't really talked about how it did, so we can do that. But he did live quite a long time. He was quite old when he went to Parthia.
Yes, for a Roman, and indeed, when he was on his way to Parthia, he meets an old guy, a king of Galatia called Deiotarus, who appears up and down in all sorts of bits of Roman history. And Crassus teases him because Deiotarus is old and he's building a new city in his little country. And Crassus says, you're leaving a bit late in your life to be building this new city. And Deiotarus looks at him and says, I think you're leaving it a bit late, mate, to be invading Parthia. And so it proved.
Now, this where he meets these advanced new, I guess, horse archers,
Yeah.
And this heavy cavalry as well that combine together to really make mincemeat of the Romans. Reading it again this morning, he just seems to make a series of. He's sort of defeated, but it's not a catastrophic military defeat. But he keeps on making very stupid mistakes in that agreeing to meet with the Parthian messengers and things.
Yeah, well,
because he's a canny man. I was just surprised that he would fall.
It is odd, but I think the blame for that, if you're looking at it from Crassus's point of view, goes with Gaius Cassius, because Cassius was clearly, as he later proved, not a particularly reliable second in command, as Caesar found when he had a dagger in his shoulder blades. So, and Cassius managed to escape after the defeat. So, a huge amount of what we know, or think we know, about what happened, it's not all come from Cassius, but you can detect the hand of Cassius in quite a lot of the stories, particularly the ones which we know which are not particularly creditable to Crassus. It's a sort of, because Cassius was in great danger himself. I mean, it was such a defeat, and it was such a stain on the Roman mind for so many years, decades and decades, that Cassius himself could have been punished and say, well, you were part of that absolute disaster. But Cassius's point was, well, it wouldn't have been a disaster if stubborn old Crassus had taken more notice of me and had done the things that I told him to do. And you talked about how Crassus was found. I mean, it's a bit difficult to know exactly what happened, but after the defeat, they weren't stupid, the Romans. They knew that they had to divide in order to escape, because the main thing was to make sure that the Parthians didn't know where Crassus himself was, because the old king back at the capital of Parthia wasn't going to accept that Cyranus had won his victory unless he brought back Crassus dead or alive, because they knew that this war against Parthia was Crassus's war. It wasn't really a Roman ambition to attack Parthia. If they got rid of Crassus, they thought that would be a very long way towards making sure that they weren't attacked again. So Cyranus, having had his great victory, still had to find Crassus. And of course, there are about 5 different groups, and Crassus could have been anywhere. But he goes up, but unfortunately for him, he goes to a town and where he thinks Crassus might be, calls up and says he wants to parley with Crassus. And Cassius, instead of saying, "I've no idea where he is, mate. Not here, Gov," Crassus says, "Oh yes, he'll be down here shortly." So Crassus is betrayed either deliberately or inadvertently by Cassius, and so he goes down to talk. And he still, I'm sure, at that stage, thought that he'd be able to talk his way out of it, or bribe his way out of it. I mean, he would have been able to basically say to Cyranus, "Look, I'm the richest man that you'll ever like to see, what do you want?" And he would have given him money and promises, and his aim was still to get out alive, if rather shamefaced. But unfortunately, there was it was just a sort of squabble over who was riding which horse, and the guards who were guarding Crassus to take him to Cyranus panicked and thought that they certainly didn't want to be blamed for Crassus getting away, so they killed him. So he ended up in a particularly sort of ignominious death, arguing over a horse.
Now his treatment has been I think it's been inspired. Have you ever watched Game of Thrones?
No, sorry. I know. I
well,
know. I know your viewers will find this very hard, very hard. But I've never watched the Game of Thrones.
Well, I'm not. I'm not sure it is deserving of the dedication required to watch so many series of just sheer violence and everything. But very early on, there is a character who is he has molten gold poured down his throat. And I'm most interested as to whether that was inspired by the treatment of Crassus at his end.
I'm sure it was. Well, I'm sure it was, because it is one of the most famous stories about Crassus. I mean, it's always good for an author when people really praise the cover of a book. I love that.
Yes, it is it really is a wonderful cover.
My book has a beautiful cover with a molten gold theme, which many people have commented on. It looks as though what happened, there are various stories about this, but his head was cut off in the desert and taken back. The first story we know about the head was that it was used as a prop in a Greek play. This is particularly a peculiar irony, because the Romans, of course, thought that the Parthians were barbarians. And the idea that in their capital they would be putting on Greek tragedies, which had never been put on in Rome. The Romans didn't put on Greek tragedies. They put on sort of their versions of Greek comedies.
Because the Bacchae is a particularly difficult.
It's a very difficult, very sophisticated play, but it ends, and yes, certainly it's never put on in Rome. It was an absolute high point of classical Greek writing at the end of the 5th century. So this play ends with the king Pentheus, who's an arrogant king like Crassus, who defies the god and says that they mustn't worship the god Dionysus. And Dionysus sends all the women mad, including his own mother, and they take to the hills, and they think they're hunting a mountain lion and cutting the head off a lion, but in fact they're high on religious fervor and God knows what else, and they find Pentheus and cut his head off. So there's a scene in the end of the Bacchae where they're basically passing around the head of what they think is a lion, but then the mother looks at it and says, this is my son. Not good. So that's a good tragic scene, and of course you need a head, and the story goes that the Crassus's head turned up very conveniently, and was used in this performance. The story is slightly too good to be true, but it shows you, it gives you an indication of how that was seen. And then the second account was that either before or after it was used as a prop in the play. It had molten gold poured into it, so that it would be a kind of trophy in Parthia as to what happens to greedy Romans. So this I think is much more plausible, because the Parthians put on effectively a kind of anti-triumph, which must have been a very remarkable thing to see. They found one of the prisoners who looked a bit like Crassus, or they thought looked a bit like Crassus, dressed him up in women's clothing, which was sort of humiliating for a male Roman or Parthian, put him on the back of a cart, attached lots of the things to the cart that were sort of parodies of what the Romans would put on the chariots when they were taking them through Rome. It was a public humiliation of the great idea of the Roman triumph. Well, if they were doing that, you can imagine they had a sort of victory over Crassus Museum, and it's not so unbelievable that amongst the sort of stuff that they'd taken from the Roman soldiers, including a certain amount of erotica, which they thought they all thought it was funny that the Roman soldiers carried it to erotica with them. But you can imagine that the head with stuffed with gold might have been a prime exhibit in this show.
Wonderful stuff, Peter. Well, look, I think we've come to the end. It's been very enjoyable talking to you about this brilliant race through Crassus's life. Crassus, the first tycoon. Thanks so much for your time.
Well, thank you as ever. Bye-bye.
Coming up, after Tuesday's bonus Black History Month episode, I have Max Hastings and then Mark Urban joining me. Max will be talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis and Mark on the paratroopers in World War II. I hope you can join me. Thank you and good night.